The world for King Edward was a relentless symphony of noise, a cacophony of consciousness that had no beginning and no end. For 3 centuries he had ruled from a throne of polished obsidian, and for every one of those years he had been submerged in the minds of his people. He felt their small joys like flickers of candlelight in a storm, their mundane worries a constant, droning hum beneath the surface of his own thoughts. He knew when a farmer in the southern fields feared a drought, when a merchant in the capital city coveted his rival's wealth, when a young lover in the palace kitchens ached with unrequited passion. It was his greatest weapon and his most profound curse. An omniscience that left no room for surprise, no space for true connection. For what connection could there be when he already knew the answer before the question was formed, felt the emotion before the face could express it? His court was a gallery of open books, their sycophantic thoughts cloying and predictable, their secret ambitions pathetically transparent. He moved among them as a god might, bored and isolated by his own power. Then she arrived. Her name, he learned from the mind of his perpetually flustered chamberlain, was Isabella Swan. A new maid, hired to replace an older woman who had retired to the coast. The chamberlain's thoughts were a flurry of trivialities, worries about the shine on the grand hall's marble floors, anxiety over the freshness of the linens, and a fleeting paternal concern for the new girl who seemed so out of place, so fragile against the stone immensity of the castle. Edward felt the thought, dismissed it, and turned his attention back to a tedious trade dispute with the northern duke. He was standing by the great arched window in the throne room, the late afternoon sun casting his shadow long and sharp across the floor, when he felt the shift. It was not a sound, but the absence of one. A sudden, perfect void in the symphony. It was as if a master musician in an orchestra had not simply missed a note, but had vanished from existence, leaving behind a pocket of absolute, deafening silence. He lifted his head, his ancient, weary eyes scanning the hall. The guards stood stoic, their thoughts a disciplined loop of duty and observation. The courtiers whispered in their usual cliques, their minds buzzing with gossip and intrigue. Nothing was amiss, yet everything had changed. He focused, casting his consciousness like a net across the room, searching for the source of the anomaly. He brushed past the mind of a lady-in-waiting, fretting about a tear in her gown, through the ambitious plotting of a junior minister, over the simple, weary desire of a footman wishing for his shift to end. And then he found it. The silence. She was standing near the far colonnade, a bucket of water in one hand and a cleaning cloth in the other. She was small, unassuming, with long, dark hair tied back in a simple fashion. Her head was bowed to her task, movements careful and deliberate as she wiped down the base of a marble pillar. To any other observer, she was nothing more than a new servant, invisible in her station. To Edward, she was a black hole in the fabric of his reality. He reached for her mind, a simple, reflexive act he had performed millions of times. He expected to find something. Fear of her new surroundings, perhaps, the simple focus of her task, a memory of the home she'd left behind. He found nothing. Not a wall, not a shield, not the crackling static of a mind protected by magic. He had encountered those before, crude and obvious defenses that only served to announce the presence of a secret. This was different. This was a pure, unblemished emptiness, a null space. It was as if she did not exist in the one plane where he was absolute master. His stillness drew attention. The low murmur of the court quieted as heads turned toward the throne. He felt their curiosity, their fear. The king is displeased. What has happened? Who has offended him? He ignored them. All of his formidable focus, the entirety of his ancient, powerful consciousness, was trained on the small, silent figure by the pillar. A spy. The word formed in his mind, cold and sharp. It had to be. No mortal was born with such an absence. This was a weapon, a form of dark, subtle magic he had never encountered. She had been sent to infiltrate his court, to walk through his psychic domain like a ghost, unseen, unheard. She was here to watch him, to learn his secrets, to find a weakness. A cold, unfamiliar fury began to build in his chest. For centuries, no one had been able to hide from him. This girl, this child with her plain dress and her bucket of water, was a direct, insulting challenge to his power. He watched her finish her task, her movements economical and graceful in their simplicity. She did not look up, did not seem to feel the weight of his stare, a pressure that had made generals and ambassadors tremble. She simply picked up her bucket and moved to the next pillar, her mind a continued, impossible blank. The silence was an affront. It was a lock on a door in his own house. And he, the king, found himself without a key. For the first time in a century, Edward felt a sliver of something other than ennui. It was a jagged, unsettling thing, a cocktail of fury, intrigue, and a dread he could not name. He would know her. He would break that silence, shatter it into 1,000 pieces, and see what secrets it was hiding. He would watch her until she made a mistake. And she would. They always did. The castle was a labyrinth of cold stone and suffocating silence. Bella had been here for 3 days, and the oppressive grandeur of the place seemed to leach the very warmth from her skin. Every footstep echoed. Every whispered word seemed to travel for miles down the vaulted corridors. The other servants moved with a hushed reverence, their faces etched with a permanent, low-grade fear that she was beginning to understand. It all emanated from him, the king. She had only seen him from a distance, a still, dark figure on the obsidian throne, or a fleeting shadow passing in a high gallery. But his presence was a palpable weight on the entire castle. He was a creature of myth, a monarch of impossible age and power. And she was just Bella, a girl from a small village whose only skill was a knack for leaving things cleaner than she found them. Her first day had been a blur of introductions to stern-faced housekeepers and a litany of rules, most of which seemed to boil down to one central tenet: be invisible. Do your work quietly, do not speak unless spoken to, and above all, do not draw the attention of the king. It was a rule she was more than happy to obey. The very thought of him made a nervous tremor start in her hands. The stories they told in the villages were enough to curdle milk, of his unblinking stare, his unnatural stillness, and the terrifying way he seemed to know things before they were said. On her 4th morning, the directive changed. The head chamberlain, a fussy, nervous man named Mr. Banner, found her polishing brass fittings in the west wing. His face was pale, his hands fluttering at his sides like trapped birds. "Miss Swan," he began, his voice a strained whisper, "His Majesty has requested a change in your duties." Bella's heart gave a painful lurch. She dropped her polishing cloth, her mind racing through every tiny mistake she might have made. Had she been too loud? Had she missed a spot of dust? "Sir, have I done something wrong?" No, nothing of the sort," he said, though his expression did little to reassure her. "It is a direct order. You are to be reassigned to the royal wing, specifically the king's private library and study." The blood drained from her face. The king's private chambers? It was an unthinkable assignment for a new maid. Those rooms were tended by servants who had been at the castle for decades, men and women who had proven their loyalty, and more importantly, their ability to be utterly unnoticeable. "But why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Mr. Banner looked deeply uncomfortable. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting down the empty corridor, as if the king himself might materialize from the shadows. "His Majesty's reasons are his own. You will report there immediately after your morning meal. Mrs. Cope, the senior maid for the wing, will instruct you. Do your work well, girl, and be careful." He scurried away, leaving Bella standing with the scent of brass polish sharp in her nostrils, and a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The royal library was a place of breathtaking beauty and terrifying silence. It was a cavern of knowledge, with shelves stretching 2 stories high, crammed with books bound in leather and gold. A rolling ladder snaked along one wall, and the air smelled of old paper, wood polish, and something else. Something clean and cold, like winter air. Bella felt impossibly small and clumsy within its hallowed space. Mrs. Cope, a woman with a face like carved granite, gave her instructions in a clipped, low voice, her eyes constantly flicking toward the large oak doors at the far end of the room. The king's study. You will dust every shelf, starting from the east wall. Use the softest lamb's wool. Do not disturb the placement of any book. Do not open any book. You will work from the top down. You will be silent. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, Bella murmured, her voice sounding like a squeak in the vast space. She set to her task, her hands trembling as she climbed the ladder. Her focus narrowed to the small patch of shelf in front of her, to the rhythmic, gentle sweep of the duster. It was the only way to keep the fear at bay, to lose herself in the mindless repetition of the work. But she could feel him. Even with the study doors closed, his presence was a low hum of energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. An hour passed, then 2. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft shush of her duster and the faint creak of the ladder's wheels. She was just reaching for a high corner when the oak doors to the study opened without a sound. He stood there, framed in the doorway, and the air in the room seemed to crystallize. He was taller than she had imagined, and impossibly graceful. He wore simple, dark clothing that did nothing to diminish the aura of immense power that clung to him like a shroud. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a strange, liquid gold, and they fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Bella froze on the ladder, her duster held aloft, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. He said nothing. He simply watched her. The silence stretched, thin and taut, and Bella felt a desperate, panicked urge to say something, to explain her presence. But the chamberlain's warning echoed in her mind. Be invisible. She lowered her duster slowly, her movements stiff with terror, and tried to continue her work. But it was impossible. His gaze was a weight, pinning her in place. Every sweep of her hand felt clumsy. Every breath she took seemed a thunderous intrusion into his sanctum. She could feel his scrutiny, cold and analytical. It was not the idle glance of a master at a servant. It was the focused, predatory stillness of a wolf watching a rabbit, waiting for the slightest misstep. Why? The question screamed in her mind. What had she done to warrant this? She was nobody, a speck of dust in his magnificent, terrifying world. Yet the king of this ancient, powerful kingdom stood in the doorway of his private study, and all of his attention, all of his unnerving, silent focus was on her. She dared a fleeting glance at him, and found his golden eyes still locked on hers, his expression unreadable, and the silence in the room deepened, becoming not an absence of sound, but a presence of all its own. He let the silence ferment, observing its effect on her. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the polished wood of the ladder. A fine tremor ran through her arm. Her breathing was shallow, a frightened bird's panic trapped in her chest. All of it was plain on her face, in the rigid set of her shoulders. Her fear was a scent in the air, sharp and honest. And yet, behind that palpable terror, her mind remained a perfect, infuriating void. You, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the effortless command of centuries. It resonated in the vast library, startling her so much she nearly lost her footing. She clung to the ladder, her wide brown eyes fixed on him. Come down. Slowly, as if wading through a thick current, she descended. Each step was hesitant, the soft soles of her shoes making no sound on the rungs. When she reached the floor, she stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her head bowed. She was looking at the floor, at a patch of sunlight on the intricate parquet. "Look at me," he commanded, and the words were not harsh, but they were immovable. She flinched, but she obeyed. Her head lifted, and her eyes, a deep, clear chocolate brown, met his. They were filled with a pure, unadulterated fear. He had seen fear before, thousands of times. He knew its every flavor, the bitter fear of the condemned, the sour fear of the sycophant, the sharp fear of the warrior facing death. Hers was the simple, clean fear of a small creature before a predator. There was no guile in it, no calculation. He felt a flicker of something, a dissonance between what he saw and what he believed. "What is your name?" he asked, stepping further into the library. The doors to his study swung silently shut behind him. They were alone. "Isabella Swan, Your Majesty." Her voice was a whisper, fragile as spun glass. "Isabella Swan," he repeated, tasting the syllables. He moved closer, circling her slowly. She remained frozen in place, her eyes tracking him, her body tense to flee. "You are new to the palace." "Yes, Your Majesty, 4 days." "And in these 4 days, you have found yourself assigned to my private chambers, a position of great trust, usually reserved for those who have served the crown for decades. Why do you think that is?" His voice was smooth, conversational, a silken trap. He was watching for the lie, the flicker of triumph in her eyes, the mental slip that would betray her. She swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. I do not know, Your Majesty. Mr. Banner told me it was your order." It was. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough to see the faint pulse beating at the base of her throat. It was a frantic, terrified rhythm. "I have a question for you, Isabella Swan. And I require a truthful answer. Your comfort, and indeed your continued employment, depends on it." "I will answer truthfully, Your Majesty," she breathed. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "What is the nature of the magic you employ? Is it an heirloom? A bloodline curse? Or did you seek out some hedge witch in a forgotten village to weave a spell of silence for you?" Her brow furrowed. The fear in her eyes was momentarily replaced by a profound, bewildered confusion. It was so genuine it was almost convincing. "Magic?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. I have no magic. I am a maid." The denial was expected. The sheer, unvarnished confusion was not. There was no mental flinch, no hastily constructed lie he could sense at the edges of her silence. There was only the silence itself, absolute and unyielding. Frustration, a hot, unfamiliar emotion, coiled in his gut. He was used to peeling back layers of thought to find the truth nestled within. With her, there were no layers. There was only a wall of nothing. "Do not play the fool with me," he hissed, the silken tone vanishing, replaced by the razor's edge of his anger. "No one is born with a mind like yours. It is a shield, an elaborate deception. Who sent you? Who do you serve? Is it the shadow court of the unseelie? The sunstone coven? Answer me." Tears welled in her eyes, magnifying the terror and confusion. They spilled over, tracing clean paths down her dust-smudged cheeks. "I serve you, Your Majesty," she choked out, a sob catching in her throat. "My father was a farmer. My mother was a baker. There is no magic. There is no coven. I swear it. I swear it on my life." He stared at her, at the tears that she made no move to wipe away, at the genuine bewilderment that warred with her fear. He saw a plain, ordinary, terrified human girl. And yet, the silence in her mind screamed that she was something more. It was a paradox, a puzzle he could not solve, and the inability to simply know was maddening. He, who could divine the most complex political plots with a passing thought, was being thwarted by a weeping maid. He straightened up, pulling his power and his anger back into himself. "You will continue your duties," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "You will work here, in my library, and in my study. Every day. And I will be watching you. Every moment. The truth cannot hide forever. When you are ready to abandon this charade, you will tell me." He turned on his heel and walked back to his study without another word, the heavy doors closing behind him with a soft, final click. He left her standing alone in the center of the vast library, shaking and weeping, her simple, honest fear a more confounding mystery than any spell he had ever encountered. And in the perfect, silent space where her thoughts should be, he felt nothing but his own echoing frustration. The days bled into weeks, and a strange, tense rhythm established itself. Every morning, Bella would arrive at the Royal Library, her heart a cold stone in her chest. And every day, he would be there. Sometimes he would be at the massive mahogany desk in his study, the doors left deliberately ajar, scratch of his quill on parchment the only sound. Other times he would be in the library itself, seated in a high-backed leather chair by the fire, a book open in his lap. But he was never reading. He was watching her. His golden eyes followed her every move. He watched her climb the ladder, her slim form stretched to reach the highest shelves. He watched her polish the brass railings until they gleamed. He watched her careful, methodical movements as she straightened books, her touch gentle and respectful. She never met his gaze directly, keeping her own eyes fixed on her tasks. Her world shrunk to the few feet of space around her. But she felt his stare like a constant pressure on her skin, a silent, unending interrogation. Edward found himself caught in a state of suspended fascination. His initial conviction that she was a spy began to fray at the edges, worn down by the sheer, unyielding mundanity of her existence. He observed her outside the library as well, his mind a silent sentinel. He felt her brief, shy interactions with other staff in the kitchens, a shared smile with a cook, a quiet word of thanks to a footman who held a door for her. He sensed her simple, uncomplicated thoughts about them. He has kind eyes. She seems tired today. No, that wasn't right. He didn't sense her thoughts. He inferred them from her actions, from the subtle softening of her expression, from the dip of her head. He was forced to interpret, to deduce, to do the clumsy work of a common mortal trying to understand another. It was exhausting. It was infuriating. It was utterly captivating. One afternoon, she was dusting a low table near his chair. As she reached for a small, intricately carved jade bird, her hand trembled and she fumbled, knocking it from its perch. The bird, a priceless artifact from the silent dynasties, fell to the thick rug with a soft thud. Bella gasped, her face draining of all color. She snatched it up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it as she inspected it for damage. He said nothing, simply watched. Her terror was a living thing in the room. He could see her imagining the consequences, dismissal or worse. The dungeons were not just a legend. He saw her take a deep, shuddering breath, her small shoulders squaring. She turned to him, the jade bird held out in her trembling palms. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I was careless. It is my fault. I will accept any punishment." He looked from the bird to her face. Her eyes were wide with fear, but they were steady. She was not trying to hide what she had done. She was not making excuses. She was simply presenting the truth, and herself for judgment. The chamberlain would have groveled, his mind a whirlwind of excuses. A courtier would have tried to blame the uneven flooring, their thoughts a slick river of self-preservation. Bella simply stood there, honest and terrified. "It is not broken," he stated, his voice flat. "No, Your Majesty."
"Thank God."
The words were a relieved prayer. "Place it back on the table," he commanded. She did so, her touch now impossibly delicate. "And be more careful." "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty." She backed away, her movements jerky, and quickly returned to her work on the far side of the room, her back to him. He stared at the spot where she had stood, at the small jade bird resting on the polished wood. Her reaction had been so human, so guileless. A spy, a trained operative, would have shown more composure. A witch with powerful magic would not be so easily undone by a simple case of nerves. Everything he observed about her, every small gesture and honest reaction, contradicted the impossible silence in her head. The dissonance was becoming a physical ache behind his eyes. He was a king who ruled by knowing, and this girl, with her dusting cloths and her clumsy, fearful honesty, was forcing him to learn a new, forgotten language, the language of observation, of inference, of trust. And he trusted nothing and no one, especially not the silent, beautiful enigma who was, against all logic, beginning to feel less like a threat and more like the only real thing in his gilded, hollow world. The tension in the library, a space that had once been his sanctuary, had become a fine, high-strung wire. 6 weeks now. 6 weeks he had watched her, and the mystery of her was no clearer than it had been on the first day. The lack of resolution was beginning to wear on his control, a slow erosion of the icy calm that had defined his existence for centuries. He had tried everything short of physical coercion, a line he was loath to cross, not out of any moral compunction, but because it felt like a crude admission of defeat. His power was his mind, and his mind had failed him. This afternoon, the frustration was a living beast inside him. He had spent the morning in a council meeting, swimming in the petty, greedy thoughts of his ministers, their minds a swamp of ambition and deceit. Emerging from that cesspool into the clean, perfect silence of Bella's presence was no longer a relief. It was a goad. The contrast was too stark. The silence was a judgment on his own tainted world. She was on her knees, polishing the ornate brass legs of a large globe stand in the corner of the room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high-arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a halo around her dark hair. She was humming, a soft, tuneless little sound, so quiet it was barely audible. It was a sound of simple contentment, the kind of absent noise one makes when focused on a task. And it broke something in him. He rose from his chair, his movement so swift and silent that she didn't notice him until his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes widening. The little humming sound died in her throat. He saw the familiar fear leap into her expression, but this time he saw something else alongside it, a weary resignation. She was growing accustomed to his moods, to his unnerving presence. "Enough," he said, his voice a low growl. He reached down and his fingers closed around her upper arm, pulling her to her feet. Her skin was warm, soft, and the contact sent a strange, unexpected jolt through him. A spark of heat against his marble-cold flesh. She gasped, a small, frightened sound. "Your Majesty." "I am weary of this game," he said, his grip tightening slightly. He was towering over her, forcing her to crane her neck to look at him. He wanted to intimidate her, to finally break through her composure. "I have been patient. I have watched you. I have listened to your pathetic, trembling denials. My patience has reached its end." He backed her against the towering shelves of books, trapping her. One hand went to the wall beside her head, his body caging hers. He was close enough to see the frantic flutter of her eyelashes, to smell the clean, simple scent of soap and lavender that clung to her. "Tell me who you are," he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Tell me what dark pact you made to conceal yourself from me. Tell me now, and I may yet show you mercy." Tears streamed down her face, silent and desperate. "There is no game," she pleaded, her voice thick with unshed sobs. "Please, you have to believe me. There is nothing to tell. I don't know why you can't, why you think I'm just me." Her raw, genuine distress was a physical blow. Her body trembled in his grasp. This was not the defiance of a hardened spy or the cunning of a powerful sorceress. This was the utter despair of an innocent creature caught in a trap it could not comprehend. He looked into her tear-filled brown eyes, and for the first time, he saw past the infuriating silence of her mind. He saw her. He saw a young woman, ripped from her simple life, terrified and alone, being tormented daily by a monster she had done nothing to provoke. And in that moment of seeing, a profound and unwelcome shift occurred within him. The anger, the frustration, the centuries of paranoid suspicion, they did not vanish, but they were suddenly overshadowed by a different feeling, something fierce and unfamiliar. It was a sharp, painful pang of protectiveness. It made no sense. She was the threat, the anomaly. But his own predatory instincts, honed over a millennium, were suddenly, inexplicably, recoiling from her pain. He felt like the villain in a story he had not written. He released her arm as if it had burned him. He stepped back, putting space between them. The back of her head hit the bookshelf with a soft thud, and she slid down slightly, her legs seeming to give way. She watched him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her expression a mixture of terror and utter exhaustion. He turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of what he had done. He walked to the window, placing his hands on the cold stone of the sill, and stared out at the manicured perfection of the palace gardens. The symphony of the world rushed back in. The thoughts of the gardeners, the guards, the distant city, but it was all just noise. The only thing that felt real was the ragged sound of her breathing in the silent room behind him. He had set out to break her, to unravel her secrets. Instead, he felt as if he were the one coming undone. The silence he had sought to conquer was now a mirror, and in it he saw a tyrant, a bully, a fool. And the protector he never knew he could be warred with the monster he had always been. The grand hall was a tapestry of sound and light, a rare state occasion that demanded Edward's presence. Gilded chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow on the assembled nobility, their silks and velvets a riot of color against the cool gray stone. The air was thick with the scent of wine, perfume, and ambition. For Edward it was a sensory assault. The music from the minstrel's gallery warred with the crashing waves of 1,000 minds. Jealousy from a baron whose wife was dancing with another, the cold calculation of a diplomat from a rival kingdom, the vacuous vanity of a young countess admiring her own reflection in a silver platter. It was a familiar, draining chaos. He sat on his throne on the raised dais, a remote, still figure observing the pageant, his face an unreadable mask. His gaze, however, kept drifting. He had allowed Bella to be assigned to the serving staff for the evening, a decision he now questioned. He had told himself it was to keep her close, to observe her in a different environment. The truth, he was loath to admit, was that the thought of her being anywhere he could not see her had become intolerable. He found her near the edge of the room, her movements swift and quiet as she offered a tray of goblets to a group of laughing courtiers. She looked small and overwhelmed, a brown sparrow in a flock of peacocks. Her simple servant's uniform was a stark contrast to the surrounding opulence. As he watched, a young, arrogant lordling deliberately jostled her arm, causing wine to slosh over the side of a goblet onto the floor. He laughed, a cruel, braying sound, and made a cutting remark about her clumsiness that Edward felt more than heard. Bella flushed, a deep, painful red, murmured an apology, and knelt to clean the spill, her head bowed in humiliation. The protective rage that had flickered to life in the library now roared into a bonfire. It was a primal, possessive fury that shocked him with its intensity. The urge to cross the hall, to wrap his hand around that lordling's throat and squeeze the laughter from him, was so powerful he had to grip the arms of his throne, his knuckles turning white. He was the king. He could do it. He could end the man for the insult, and no one would dare question him. But he remained seated, his body rigid, his power leashed by a thread of control. He could not reveal his interest. It would put her in even greater danger. It was then that the world tilted on its axis. Attack came without warning. There was no surge of murderous intent in the minds around him, no flicker of a conspiratorial thought. One moment the hall was filled with music and chatter. The next, 3 of the liveried footmen standing near the great doors moved with impossible speed. They were not footmen. They were assassins, their minds shielded by a powerful, ancient magic that had masked them completely. It was a far cruder shield than Bella's silence, a wall of crackling, violent static. But it had been enough. Daggers coated in the silver and ash poison that was one of the few things truly lethal to his kind, flashed in the chandelier light. Screams erupted as the courtiers scrambled back. The royal guard, caught by surprise, surged forward, but the assassins were preternaturally fast, moving through the chaos like wolves through a flock of sheep. Their target was clear. They were coming for him. Edward was on his feet in an instant, a low snarl ripping from his throat. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. He saw the arc of a thrown dagger as it flew toward his chest. He could have dodged it easily. He could have caught it, but his eyes were not on the blade. They were on Bella. She was frozen, trapped between the surging crowd and the assassin's path. She had been making her way toward the kitchens, and now she stood directly between him and one of the attackers. Her face was a mask of pure terror, her eyes wide, her body paralyzed by shock. The assassin, his eyes fixed on the throne, raised a blade to strike her down, to clear his path to the king. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle. In that elongated, silent moment, instinct obliterated reason. Paranoia, suspicion, the mystery of her silent mind, it all burned away to nothing. There was only one imperative, one thought that screamed louder than all the others. Protect her. He moved. He was a blur of black, crossing the 20 feet of marble that separated them in less than a heartbeat. He reached her an instant before the assassin's blade did. He didn't push her aside. He didn't throw her to safety. He wrapped his body around hers, shielding her completely, his back to the attacker. He pulled her flush against his chest, his arm clamped around her waist, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, pressing her face into his shoulder. He braced for the impact of the poisoned dagger. And then her skin touched his. It was not the brief, incidental contact of the library. This was flesh against flesh, her cheek pressed to the thin fabric of his tunic, his hand against her hair, his body a shield around hers. The moment their bodies made true, desperate contact, something ignited. It was not a spark, it was a supernova. A tidal wave of energy, of pure, undiluted knowing, crashed through him. It was a feeling of homecoming, of finding a piece of his soul he had not known was missing for 1,000 years. It was recognition on a cellular, spiritual level, a bond, snapping into place with the force of a collapsing star. It sang through his veins, a silent, perfect music that drowned out all the noise of the world, all the chaos of the attack. It was peace. It was rightness. It was a truth more profound than any thought he had ever read. He felt the assassin's blade, not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, distant annoyance. It slid into the muscle of his shoulder, the poison a cold burn. It meant nothing. All that mattered was the small, trembling woman in his arms, the warmth of her body against his, and the cataclysmic, beautiful truth that had just rewritten his entire existence. He held her tighter, a low, possessive growl rumbling in his chest. Not of anger now, but of absolute territorial finality. She was his. The world had just tried to take her from him. The world would pay. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled violence. The royal guard, loyal and lethally efficient, dispatched the assassins with brutal finality. The grand hall, a moment before a scene of revelry, was now a tableau of fear and death. Courtiers huddled against the walls, their minds a frantic storm of terror that beat against Edward's consciousness. But he barely felt it. The symphony of noise he had lived with for centuries was a distant echo, muted by the roaring, magnificent silence of the bond that now connected him to the woman in his arms. He still held her, his body a fortress around hers. The dagger was still embedded in his shoulder, the poison a sluggish, cold fire that his preternatural healing was already fighting. He barely noticed. Bella was shaking uncontrollably, her face still buried in his chest, her small hands clutching the fabric of his tunic. He could feel the frantic, terrified hammering of her heart against his ribs. It was the only sound that mattered. Gently, he pulled back, his hands moving to frame her face. He needed to see her eyes. She looked up at him, her own wide brown eyes swimming with tears and a new, dawning confusion. He saw his own shock and overwhelming discovery reflected there. She had felt it too. The snap of the bond, the sudden, inexplicable sense of rightness. Her mind was still a perfect, beautiful void to him, but he no longer needed to hear it. He could feel her. He could feel her terror, her confusion, and beneath it all, a nascent, fragile sense of safety. "You are unharmed?" His voice was rough, a raw sound he barely recognized as his own. She could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. He looked down at the dagger in his shoulder, then reached up and pulled it free with a single, smooth motion, dropping the poisoned steel to the floor where it clattered on the marble. He felt the wound begin to seal, the ancient power in his blood neutralizing the toxin. The captain of his guard, a grim-faced vampire named Jasper, was suddenly at his side. "Your Majesty, are you?" "Secure the hall," Edward commanded, his voice regaining its authority. "Find out who sent them. I want answers." He didn't wait for a reply. Scooping Bella into his arms as if she weighed nothing, he turned from the chaos and strode from the hall, ignoring the gasps and frantic whispers of his court. He carried her through the winding corridors of the palace, his long strides eating up the distance to the royal wing. She was pliant in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing still ragged. He didn't take her to her servants' quarters. He took her to his own private chambers, a place no one but he had entered in over a century. He swept through the sitting room and into his bedroom, a vast, Spartan space dominated by a large bed and windows that looked out over the sleeping city. He laid her gently on the bed, pulling a thick fur throw over her trembling form. She stared up at him, her expression lost. What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a question that encompassed everything, the attack, his impossible speed, the feeling that had passed between them. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of the words felt strange in his mouth. "But I will find out." He turned and left the room, closing the heavy doors behind him, leaving her safe within his sanctuary. He strode back out into the corridor and issued a single, sharp command to the guards now posted there. "No one enters, no one leaves. She is not to be disturbed." Then he went to the library. Not to his chair, but to the summoning bell on his desk. He rang it twice, a specific, urgent peal that had not been used in 50 years. He needed knowledge. He needed the keeper of the old laws, the lore master of their kind. A few minutes later, the library doors opened to admit an ancient vampire named Eleazar. He was from the old country, his face a roadmap of time, his eyes holding the patient wisdom of forgotten ages. He had been Edward's tutor when Edward was still a fledgling, centuries ago. "You rang, my king," Eleazar said, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. He took in Edward's torn tunic, the faint, dark stain of blood on his shoulder, his agitated energy. "There has been trouble." "Assassins," Edward said, pacing the length of the room. "Shielded, but that is not why I summoned you." He stopped, turning to face his old mentor. "Tell me of the true mate bond, the old tales. Not the romantic nonsense we feed the fledglings, but the truth of it." Eleazar raised a thin, white eyebrow. This was unexpected. "It is a legend, mostly, a 1 in a billion chance, a perfect resonance between two souls, vampire or human. It is said to be an unbreakable connection, a bond of absolute truth and protection." "Why do you ask?" Edward's voice was low, intense. "I have met a human woman. Her mind, it is silent to me, a complete void. I believed her to be a spy, a witch using some unknown magic to shield herself." He paused, the memory of the last hour crashing over him again. "Tonight, during the attack, I shielded her with my body. Our skin touched, and I felt it. The bond. It settled into place like a key in a lock I never knew existed." Eleazar's ancient eyes widened, a flicker of profound shock in their depths. He was silent for a long moment, processing the impossible. "A silent mind," he murmured, more to himself than to Edward. "Of course." "What do you mean, of course?" Edward demanded, his patience thin. Eleazar looked at him, and his expression was one of dawning wonder. "The old texts are obscure, fragmented, but they speak of it, the sacred silence. It is the ultimate sign of the bond, its very first manifestation. My king, you have been laboring under a terrible misapprehension. The girl's silent mind was not a shield against you." He took a step forward, his voice filled with a new, reverent awe. "It was a sanctuary, waiting for you. True mates cannot read each other's minds. The bond itself forbids it." Edward stared at him, the world seeming to stop. "Forbids it? Why?" "For trust," Eleazar said simply. "Your gift, my king, is a formidable weapon, but it precludes the most fundamental aspects of a relationship: faith, vulnerability, the slow and sacred act of revealing oneself through words. The bond protects that. It strips away your omniscience to force you to do what you have never had to do with anyone. Listen. It ensures that the connection between you is built not on stolen thoughts and easy certainty, but on the difficult, beautiful, and honest work of communication." Her mind was not closed to you. It was open in a way no other mind could ever be. It was waiting for you to speak to it, instead of just reading it. The truth of Eleazar's words slammed into Edward with the force of a physical blow. The silence. The perfect, infuriating, beautiful silence. It wasn't a wall, it was an invitation. It wasn't a deception, it was the most profound truth he had ever encountered. Every suspicion he had harbored, every harsh word he had spoken, every moment he had terrified her, it all cascaded over him in a wave of shame and regret so powerful it buckled his knees. He had been so wrong, so blind. He had treated a miracle as a threat, a gift as a curse. And he had terrified the one person in all of existence who was made for him. He had to go to her. He had to explain. He had to beg for the forgiveness he in no way deserved. He found her sitting on the edge of the massive bed, the fur throw clutched around her shoulders like a shield. She looked impossibly small in the cavernous room. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the space feel both intimate and intimidating. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, snapped to him the moment he entered. He saw the familiar fear there, but it was now laced with a deep, searching confusion. She was waiting. He closed the doors softly behind him, the sound echoing the finality of the one in the library, but this time it felt different. It was not a closing off, but a sealing in, creating a private world for just the two of them. For a long moment, he simply stood there, drinking in the sight of her. The silence in her mind was no longer a void. It was a quiet, holy space. It was hers. And he felt a surge of protective tenderness for it, for her, so fierce it stole his breath. He had planned speeches on the walk from the library, eloquent apologies crafted by a mind used to commanding language, but they all felt hollow and false now. The bond demanded something simpler. It demanded truth. He crossed the room and knelt before her. The act was so foreign to him, so contrary to the centuries of kingship that defined him, that it felt like shedding an old skin. He knelt on the cold stone floor, bringing his eyes level with hers. He was no longer a king interrogating a subject. He was just a man, flawed and penitent, before the woman he had wronged. "Bella," he said, and using her name felt both impossibly intimate and profoundly right. Her breath hitched. "I owe you an apology so vast I do not have the words for it." She just watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped the fur. "For 6 weeks I have terrorized you," he continued, his voice low and raw with self-recrimination. "I have treated you with suspicion and cruelty. I accused you of being a spy, a witch, a liar. I saw your innocence and I called it a deception. I saw your fear and I called it a performance. I was wrong. About everything, I was wrong." He took a hesitant breath, forcing himself to meet her bewildered gaze. "My entire life I have been able to hear the thoughts of others. It is a part of who I am. When you arrived, your mind was silent to me. I had never encountered such a thing. My power, my paranoia, my arrogance, they all led me to the darkest possible conclusion. I could not conceive of a silence born of anything but malice." He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. The constant scrutiny, the bizarre questions, it was beginning to make a terrible kind of sense to her. "Tonight," he went on, his voice softening, "when we touched, we both felt something, a connection. An ancient law of our kind calls it the true mate bond. It is a recognition of souls." He paused, searching for the right words he had never needed before. "Eleazar, my oldest advisor, he explained it to me. The silence in your mind is not a shield. It is the very nature of the bond. It is a protection. It ensures that what passes between us must be real, earned. It forces me to put aside my power and learn to listen, to speak, to build trust in the way mortals do." He finally risked reaching out, not to grab or compel, but a simple, open-handed gesture. He laid his hand on the fur throw near her knee, not touching her, but offering contact. "The silence I feared was a gift I was too blind to see. It was meant to lead me to you, to teach me a better way. Instead, I used it as a weapon against you. I am more sorry than I can ever say. For every moment I frightened you, for every tear I caused. Is it possible you could ever forgive me?" Bella stared at him, at the ancient, powerful king kneeling at her feet, his golden eyes filled with a pain and a vulnerability she had never imagined possible. His explanation was insane, a fairy tale of mind-reading and soul bonds, but the feeling that had ripped through her when he'd held her, that had been real. The sudden, inexplicable sense of safety in the arms of the man who had terrified her for weeks, that had been real. And the raw, aching sincerity on his face now, that was the most real thing of all. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted a hand from the fur. She reached out and her small, warm fingers brushed against his cold ones. At the touch, the feeling of rightness, of peace, bloomed between them again, a quiet, steady warmth. "I was so scared," she whispered, her first words in this new world. A look of profound pain crossed his face. "I know," he said, his voice thick, "and that is my eternal shame." She looked at their joined hands, then back to his face. The fear was finally, truly gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative wonder. "You have to teach me," she said. He looked confused. "Teach you what?" "How to talk to a king," she said, a tiny, watery smile touching her lips for the first time. "Who is also this?" He let out a shaky breath, a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and his fingers finally, gently, closed around hers. "No," he said, his golden eyes impossibly soft. "You have to teach me how to just be Edward." The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. The oppressive tension that had defined Bella's existence in the castle evaporated, replaced by a delicate, unfolding curiosity. Edward dismissed her from her duties as a maid, an act that sent a wave of scandalous speculation through the court's ever-churning mill of gossip. He did not, however, elevate her to a public position. He did not make her a lady of the court or shower her with jewels. Instead, he did something far more intimate and, to the outside world, far more perplexing. He simply kept her with him. Their world shrank to the quiet, protected space of the royal wing. The library, once a chamber of interrogation and fear, became their sanctuary. The dynamic was completely inverted. Where he had once watched her in suspicious silence, now he spoke, and she listened. He told her stories of his long life, of centuries past, of the fall of empires and the birth of nations. He spoke of his lonely childhood as a human boy in a world long since turned to dust, and of the violent, painful rebirth that had made him what he was. He spoke of the crushing weight of his unwanted gift, the relentless noise that had been his only companion for 300 years. He unburdened his soul, piece by piece, offering the stories to her like fragile treasures. Bella, in turn, began to fill the beautiful silence he had once feared. She told him of her own simple life, of the smell of her mother's bakery in the morning, of the feel of soil under her fingernails from her father's garden, of her secret love for wildflowers and sad songs. Her stories were small, mundane, and utterly magical to him. Each detail she shared was a revelation, a precious piece of information he had not stolen from her mind, but had been freely given. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of twilight, that she was afraid of spiders, that she hummed when she was content. He learned her not through a violation of her privacy, but through the patient, sacred act of paying attention. One afternoon, they sat in their usual chairs by the fire. A light snow was falling outside, dusting the world in a blanket of white. Edward was reading to her from a book of old poetry, his voice a low, melodic baritone that filled the comfortable quiet between them. He paused, looking at her over the top of the leather-bound volume. She was watching the fire, her face soft in its flickering light, a small, contented smile on her lips. "What are you thinking?" he asked. The question was soft, born of genuine curiosity. It was a question he had never truly needed to ask anyone before. She turned her gaze to him, her brown eyes warm and clear. "I was thinking that this is the quietest place I have ever been," she said. "It used to be a terrifying quiet. Now, it feels like peace." "For me as well," he admitted. The constant hum of the castle's thoughts was still there, at the edges of his consciousness, but it was muted, distant. The silence of their shared space, the silence of her, was the anchor that held him, a calm harbor in a chaotic sea. He set the book aside. "Bella," he began, a new seriousness in his tone. "The court whispers. They do not understand. They see you, a commoner, always at my side. They invent reasons, none of them kind." She looked down at her hands, her smile fading slightly. "I know. I could silence them," he said. "I could make you a duchess. I could give you a title and lands that would force their respect." She was quiet for a moment, then she looked back up at him, her expression earnest. But that wouldn't be real, would it? It would just be another thing you did to me. Like assigning me to the library. It would be about your power, not about us. She hesitated, then found her courage. I don't want a title, Edward. I just want this. To learn you. And for you to learn me. His heart, the long, still muscle in his chest, ached with a tenderness that was almost painful. She was right. He was still thinking like a king, of solving problems with power and pronouncements. She was teaching him to think like a partner, to solve problems with honesty and connection. He rose from his chair and walked to the massive globe stand, the one she had been polishing that day he had finally broken. He ran a hand over its smooth, curved surface. This room, he said, his voice thoughtful. It has seen the worst of me, my paranoia, my cruelty, and it has seen the best of you, she countered softly, coming to stand beside him. It saw you apologize. It saw you learn to listen. He turned to her, his golden eyes searching her face. Is that enough? Can what we are building here be enough to make up for how we began? Bella reached out and with a boldness that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, placed her hand on his chest directly over his heart. His skin was cool, but she imagined she could feel the deep, ancient stillness within. We didn't begin in fear, Edward, she said, her voice full of a conviction that settled deep into his soul. We began the moment you chose to protect me. We began with the bond. Everything before that was just a long, dark road to get us here. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it closer. The simple, profound rightness of her touch, of their bond, washed over him. She was his mate, his partner, his teacher. She had walked into his silent, ordered world and filled it not with noise, but with a quiet, resonant truth. He had spent his life reading minds, and all he had found was deception and emptiness. But in the one mind he could not read, he had finally found a home. He leaned down and for the first time gently pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. A promise of a future built not on stolen thoughts, but on shared words, earned trust, and the beautiful, sacred silence that was theirs alone.